Hi, everybody. I hope everyone's enjoying day 2 of the BITS annual meeting. Again, I'm Carson Cristiano. I'm the executive director of CIGA, the Center for Effective Global Action. This is where BITS has been based for the last 10 years. And right now, I am going to introduce our plenary session on transparency and policy analysis. So I think everybody here is an advocate of evidence-based policy, which, at least in theory, involves taking research and then making highly consequential funding and program design decisions based on some kind of analysis. And so if we care about the transparency and reproducibility of the underlying research, then we should also care about the transparency and reproducibility of the analysis that's used to inform these policy decisions. So this session is going to present 3 initiatives that aim to introduce the principles of open science into policy analysis. So in other words, we're talking about the process of contextualizing evidence for policymaking. We're going to start with our very own Fernando Hoces de la Guardia, who's a project scientist at BITS. We're then going to hear from Jason DeBacher and Max Jennis at University of South Carolina, and then Policy Engine, respectively. So we're going to start with Fernando. He works on computational reproducibility and the use of open science tools and practice in policy analysis, and he's going to tell us about some work that he's done to construct an open policy analysis, or OPA, of deworming interventions. So go ahead, Fernando.
Thank you very much, Carson. I'm going to share my screen now. Can everybody see my screen?
Looks great.
Great. Okay. So yes, thank you very much for being here. This has been a very exciting conference. I'm very happy to be talking here today about transparency for policy and application, from transparency for policy analysis with an application for deworming interventions. As Carson said, the application that we will be discussing today, it's going to be what we call the open policy analysis framework. But I do want to start first with just making the general case for transparency in policy analysis as a general motivation. And I think that this will help sort of like contextualize the next talks that are also pushing for transparency in policy analysis and could help as a common motivation. So I did want to build a very, very basic example that illustrate what this is important. So I just want to start with how would an ideal policy analysis report would look like. First of all, this would be it would be developed to inform a prospective policy debate. That's an important difference with research that most often tends to inform about the effects of previous policies or interventions. Second, it would have two clearly, or it would have the key populations clearly identified. Here, I'm just separating them in the blue population and the green population. And for each population, you would clearly see costs and benefits, or the different effects across these populations, ideally using comparable units. So you would, in this case, compare oranges to oranges. And here we will see that for the blue population, this is a hypothetical policy analysis for a policy X. For the blue population, this policy has a cost of 3 oranges and a benefit of 6. While for the green population, it has a cost of 4 and a benefit of 1. So it is beneficial for one population and harmful for the other. Overall, it's neutral. Because I do want to focus more on this distributional pieces. And the important thing is that if you see a policymaker read this report, or a voter, or any key decision maker here, and they say that they support the policy, they are revealing, we are learning that they have a normative valuation, a higher normative valuation of one population over the other. So a clear, transparent policy analysis combined with decision from policymakers allow us to learn about how policymakers value things. And that's a key piece here. why is this so important? Because in the real world, we have departures from this type of analysis. Here on the left, we have what I think is the most common departure, where you have either one report or multiple reports where they show the costs and benefits for one population and the costs and benefits for the other population, but they would be like either focusing on different outcomes, different units. It would be very hard to see a policy proposal and have two analyses studying the same cost and benefits and putting them in the same units. I say this because this is in contrast to what has been more posed at a theoretical level in literature, where Mansky in economics and Wassernick in political science have proposed this idea of a report wars or dueling certitudes, where basically you have opposing reports and advocacy reports that come to a table with the same type of analysis, and one shows different results. This is theoretically, it is helpful to understand, so like what are the difficulties, but in practice, if you start looking at like real world policy analysis, for example, the California ballot propositions, where every 2 years there's some ballot propositions that they show different analysis, different proposals for the population to vote on, and they show analysis in favor and analysis against. And if you review those, for example, you will never find that the analysis in favor and the analysis against are studying exactly the same unit. For example, a famous one that just happened was about a proposition to continue or reduce labor protection for ride-sharing workers. And the analysis, although they were similar of the opponents and of the advocates, one was talking about the effect on the median wage. The other one was talking about the effect on the base wage, and the numbers were, it was much more an apples to oranges comparison. So that's more, this is more like the real world. Why is it relevant? It is important, in my opinion, because basically, if we cannot agree on a basic starting point of what are the facts, what are the analysis and the cost and benefits from which to have a political discussion, a normative discussion, it's easy for policymakers to choose their own reality. And that I think that resonates at least heavily with me on what's the current situation, not only in the US, but around the world. And here I'm just putting two examples, one of a senator from the right in the US and a senator from the left, discussing two policies, where here the senator of the left, of the senator from the right, is being interviewed, and he's being asked about the unemployment insurance for the pandemic. And he's being told, we have looked at what economists are saying, meaning what policy reports have been showing, and there's no effect. And he says, I don't know what economists you are talking about, basically choosing his own report. Analogously, but on the other side of the political spectrum, you have here another senator talking about healthcare reform, establishing a universal healthcare system in the US. And again, the interviewer is trying to asking about the costs of this, and he's saying, I don't think there's a study out there that does not suggest that the proposed reform is far less expensive than what we have right now. So I think a lot of the anger and a lot of the discontent is to focus on policy makers. At least from my perspective, I think that what they're doing is fairly rational, in the sense that there's a menu of reports in the proposed out there that the academic and the policy analysis community puts out there, and they're just choosing the one that fits best with their beliefs. And where's the problem in the evidence to policy pipeline? In an ideal connection between an evidence to policy pipeline, we'll have something like this. We'll have research generating knowledge about the effects of previous interventions or previous policies that then will be extrapolated in a policy analysis. And as we saw yesterday on the work of De La Viña, Vivalt, but also before Tedlock and Don Moore and others, there's this important step of eliciting predictions that inform research. One thing that it's not so much discussed is that these predictions also have to inform policy analysis, because policy analysis is an exercise of generating these quantifications in a heavily constrained environment where you do have to provide an answer to a decision maker, and sometimes you do not have the estimate that you need to close down a model or to close down an analysis. So you need to guesstimate many pieces, and that's exactly expert judgment or prediction. And in an ideal world, we will see the same advances that we're seeing here towards research, towards policy analysis. And this would generate this policy report that would inform the political debate. Notice that I'm not taking a stance of whether to support or to oppose the policy. My only goal here is to basically have a clear starting point such that the political conversation can happen in a constructive way. And why does that fail? A little bit of history connected with the topics of this conference. I think that if this is the ideal evidence to policy pipeline, I think before the credibility revolution that David Card taught us yesterday, this was a little bit more the lay of the land. The boundaries of research were not so well defined. What constitutes prior predictions and policy analysis also not so well defined. There were connections between these three, but they were somewhat unclear. And as the credibility evolution happened, I think the boundaries of research became more well defined. We had a more rigorous understanding of what credible evidence is. Also, in the last decade or so, with the advances of open science, and I say open science plus because I'm including the advances in prediction and expert judgment, we have a more well-defined prediction component, a much more well-defined research component. The interaction between the two of them are much more clear, and that contributes to this evidence to policy pipeline. But nonetheless, these three big gaps remain. Policy analysis and its connection with these other pieces has remained opaque, and I think that's the core motivation for focusing on transparency and policy analysis. I hope that this might help my fellow panelists that come after me, but this is the motivation for us to propose the open policy analysis framework, which this is a paper that we wrote with Ted Miguel and Sean Grant, where basically we propose to move away from the static one-dimensional report and focus more on a three-layer product or object that will serve different populations. So on the top, we should focus on having one output to inform policymakers. We should not give them like 30-page reports for them to choose the plot that best fits their priors. But at the same time, that one output should be clearly connected to its underlying assumptions. Moreover, all the details behind that one output that condensates the benefits and costs of a policy debate should be justified in a report, and this report should be clear in narrative, in equations, and in code, and finally, all the materials that are necessary to develop the report and the final output should be available and comply with standards of computational reproducibility. So these are pretty abstract ideas. So that this is where having an application to a specific policy comes in very handy. And this is where I'll spend most of the remaining presentation talking with you. So the specific policy that we're gonna build an application of open policy analysis, it's deworming interventions. It's a policy to tackle parasitic worm infections that are endemic in low and middle income countries. They decrease the nutrient uptake and can lead to serious consequences of human health. And here we're going to analyze mass deworming interventions at the school level. And one basically a key part here is that the policy analysis is going to be based on a study where the intervention took place in Kenya in 1998 and 1999. And the settings, the current settings in the world have changed in many dimensions. For our purposes, has changed at least on the prevalence rates of these conditions. Back then, Kenya had a very high prevalence rate of intestinal worms. That has fallen. Also, the implementation costs vary. They were low back then, but now they are lower in other places of the world, and they're also more expensive in others. And the length of treatment also has changed. Back then, it was 2.5 years, and now typically that there's a longer type of intervention. So here I'm just going to demonstrate you how a proposed open policy analysis looks like. And the main contribution specifically to the deworming setting is that this exercise basically selects one policy estimate among several alternatives and establish a clear link between that policy estimate, that output, and all of its underlying assumptions. The second contribution is that we added documentation to the existing documentation to fill in gaps to actually be able to reproduce this result, and also created a public repository with all the materials such that anybody can access this and achieve one-click or aspire to get a one-click reproducible workflow. So I have 3 minutes left, Alex. Oh yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just show you the open output, which is basically a app that anybody can access on a public website, and that I think I have it deployed here already. So it generates this final output that summarizes the cost and benefits associated with this intervention. It also shows the uncertainty around it, and it connects with the underlying assumptions, the main assumptions related to length of treatment and prevalence and things like that, but also all the other assumptions. So one thing that it's somewhat hard in connecting research with policy analysis is sometimes it's hard for researchers to see specifically how the result went into the analysis. Here, it's not only that they can see it, this is the estimate, the treatment effect from the study. They can not only see it, but they can vary it and say, okay, how the results change if we would have obtained a different treatment effect. And this could facilitate power calculations of future studies, things like that. In the interest of time, I will I'll just leave there the links for open analysis and open materials, but the open analysis, it's a document that combines narrative, equations, and code, and the materials, it's also not at the level of what Lars showed today, but it aims to get at a one-click reproducible workflow. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the barriers of scaling this type of initiatives. Why is that open policy analysis or transparency in policy analysis has not taken off as far as I would have liked it to see it? I think the key issue here is incentives. I think policymakers are better off obviously having a menu of reports. Policy analysts also have little incentives to do this, in the sense that they're constantly putting down fires and there's no time to thoroughly improve documentation. And open policy analysis, at the end of the day, beyond these fancy artifacts and things like that, it's about improving documentation. And also there's another perverse incentive that opacity in policy analysis increases the value of reputation. And in this setting, basically high credential analysts have negative incentives to increase transparency, because the more opaque, the more their credentials are useful. And finally, on the researcher side, I think that the incentives, the for researchers are pretty clear that they have all the incentives to generate novel and rigorous findings, but that trumps pretty much everything else in the long run. And there's little incentive to move beyond this less rigorous extrapolation exercises. I think language like quick and dirty calculations, back of the envelope calculations is very revealing in how little rigor it goes into this. And I also think that it doesn't help that there's like a widespread contempt of how academia looks into policy analysis. This is just the next steps for us in terms of OBA, where we're gonna release an updated version of the Deworming open policy analysis. We have also been collaborating in an employment open policy analysis, and we are looking for the next how to scale this up. And I think the key here is to find an analogous of a policy entrepreneur, something like Santiago Levy in Mexico, what he did for impact evaluations, something like that. We need a government official that is willing to basically inject this level of transparency to boost their credibility. So that's it for me for now.
Thanks so much, Fernando. That was a great, very clear presentation. We definitely need creative minds thinking about, how to tailor some of these incentives, because it's some really tough barriers that we're up against. I think all of us really, I'm sure, think that this model is a good one. And the question is, how do we get stakeholders to buy in? So thanks a lot.